Glad to hear that.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Susan Posnock, and I'm Director of Public Affairs and Education for Jewelers of America. I'm pleased to welcome you to the latest episode of My Next Question, National Jeweler and Jewelers of America's co-branded webinar series. Today's session, Take Action to Protect Your Business, is co-hosted by myself and Lenore Fedow, Associate Editor at National Jeweler, and our featured guests today are Bill Farmer, co-owner of Farmer's Jewelry, Joseph Mulfisi, President, Bella Cosa Jewelers, John Bridge, Chairman of Ben Bridge Jeweler, and Sarah Yude, Deputy General Counsel at Jewelers Vigilance Committee. A few housekeeping details before we get started. If you have questions for our panel, you can type it into the Zoom Q&A box or into the chat. And I will share questions from attendees following the main discussion. Also, today's session is being recorded and will be available on the National Jeweler and the Jewelers of America websites in the coming days. Just to kick off our conversation, I'd like to highlight some of the issues that Jewelers of America has been advocating for on behalf of our members, both current issues that we're, recently looking into, as well as some of the issues that we've covered in the past or that remain. And just to note, this is something that I feel very strongly about, that jewelers really do need to have a voice in Washington, D.C., and they need to advocate. You need to advocate for your businesses because nobody else is going to do it for you. And the more jewelers that we have who participate, who learn about the advocacy campaigns, who support JPAC, things like that, the louder voice that our industry will have. Just to note, our government affairs includes monitoring of legislation and regulations through Haken Associates, who are based in DC, legislative updates to members, meetings with lawmakers, and just, again, keeping members updated on key issues that are happening. Some of the specific issues that we're following, which I know that Lenore is going to focus on in terms of her questions, are organized retail crime and crime in general being on the rise. I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, in terms of it having an impact on the jewelry industry. And one of the methods of addressing this issue is that Congress has introduced the Combating Organized Retail Crime Act. It's bipartisan legislation that JA supports. And in fact, I'll drop a link in the chat in a moment, but we've just created a member alert on this issue so that members can actually reach out to their members of Congress in the Senate or the House in order to have your voice heard on that particular issue. Credit reform is another issue we're tracking, with swipe fees rising and lack of competition. We're also looking at consumer data privacy, and obviously consumer data is essential to retailers and to your businesses, and looking for clear rules from, basically we support national privacy legislation that protects the data privacy of Americans and offers clear rules of the road for individuals, businesses, and governments. A couple of issues that are less at the front, but kind of always keep coming back are LIFO, the last in, first out accounting method, and Jewelers of America has been lobbying and pushing for protection of that. It's an inventory accounting method, which is considered very attractive as a revenue raising option for lawmakers. So it repeatedly comes up, and it's something that we continually need to focus on when we have our meetings with members of Congress. Also, the extension of the tax cuts from 2017 with provisions that are going to expire, including taxes that would have a harmful effect on small businesses. And then finally, sales tax fairness, where we had a big victory in the Supreme Court a few years back, and it is now essentially settled on the state level, but we are still keeping an eye on it because there's some confusion that remains in terms of rather than having a national or federal solution, it's a state-by-state solution. So we continue to watch that issue and see whether or not we need to once again take up the banner and push for some sort of federal uniform solution. Finally, I mentioned JPAC. We have events through JPAC. We have our fly-in, which is being held September 12th and 13th in Washington, D.C. It's an annual event, and we do have a limited number of spots available for the general JA membership to attend. And so stay tuned. We'll be sending information on that out in the coming weeks. And we're also planning this year to have a member meetup in DC on the 12th, right before the fly-in. So I'm going to go ahead and ask an opening question to our panelists before Lenore takes over. Basically, I would like each of you to share your thoughts on the importance of being involved, and for jewelers, basically my pet project, which is getting more jewelers involved, and why you're involved, and why do you think it's important. John, I see you, so why don't we start with you?
All right. I appreciate having the opportunity to talk a little bit about this. Jewelers in general have been in the background as far as a lot of the political involvement, a lot of the legislation that comes down on a national basis that does affect our business. And it turns out that we're so busy in our retail stores for the most part that we just don't get involved. And so much of the legislation that comes down from a national standpoint and even on the state level will affect us as small business or individual retail outlets. And it is important for us to maintain connections with a lot of our legislators in order to tell them what our concerns are, whether it has to do with LIFO, which Susan just brought up, whether it has to do with certain discriminatory taxes that might affect us, tariffs that exist for particular gemstones and jewelry items. Right now, dealing with the situation of diamonds coming from, let's say, Russia, but going through other locations, we need to keep our eye on all of this. In addition to that, think about the Federal Trade Commission and how they define certain things, whether they define diamonds as, simulants, the artificially made diamonds, or whether we can use certain terminology. All of those things will affect us. And if we don't stand up and deal with our legislators, we're going to be left in the dust. And it will affect our bottom line and whether we are able to stay in business. So that's one of the reasons that I certainly have been involved with our company in making contacts with our legislators and in keeping an eye on some of the legislation that is coming down the pike, both on state as well as federal levels.
Thanks, John. Thanks. Who wants to answer next?
I'll give it a go. I mean, Bill Farmer, Farmer's Jewelry, Lexington, Kentucky. John made some very good points, and we as an industry sometimes we're very small, but sometimes in things of some of these advocacy nature, we cast a long shadow in the Capitol. But we only do that because we've been in a position to know folks, to make friends before we need them. Many of us came to this conversation, or at least I did, in 1990, 1991, when we were all surprised by a luxury tax, which brought many people to Washington at one time to lobby in a capacity that we had never really caucused about before. And it really took a lot of work, a lot of hometowns across the country to repeal that luxury tax, because it really was regressive in relation to our business specifically. But that leads to the other issues that Susan talked about, but it's that familiarity. Any customer that you know is one that you can do great business with. And that's what we've tried to become in the Capitol. And folks who have the ability to step back a little bit and get involved in that capacity see great follow through on it. but certainly the work that JA has done, especially through JPAC, to make it easy to get in contact with folks. I mean, when you can just trigger something and poof, it goes right to the people you're talking about, that's very, very effective. And that's where we come through in our short game. And whether it's something that has emerged, something that we've successfully battled for or against, there's always something next. And that's where this type of webinar and the exchange is very important for people to understand where we need to be next, maybe in relation to where we hadn't been before.
You're muted, Susan.
Yeah,
Thank
she
you, Bill. I'll
Just
jump
after I
in.
told everyone to make sure they unmuted while when they were not speaking. Joseph, it sounds like you were going to respond.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So it is important for everybody to get involved. If your voice isn't being heard, I can assure you that your opponent's point of view is being heard. And a lot of times the legislators, or even in your local city, they don't know what is best unless you tell them. You know, personally, I've had experiences where I wasn't involved and things have come up, and I was shocked at how they didn't know. One was a flashing pod camera that they thought would be a good idea to deter crime. And you know, that kind of thing drives away business. More discreet cameras that are there for them to use, but not some flashing blue light. And they thought that was a great idea, you know, until there was many businesses that brought up that no, a pod cam is not a good idea. So there's things like that. Local taxes could be a sales tax addition. City taxes are adding sales taxes. They're adding 1%. And if your voice isn't being heard and how that really does affect you, people buy jewelry as a total line item. Taking that tax into consideration is really 1% off your bottom line. So speaking up and telling them about your point of view, knowing that you're an important part of the community and they do want to hear from you. They have 1,000 different issues that they're dealing with every day. So it is important to be involved so you don't get blindsided and for them to make better informed decisions.
Thanks, Joseph. Sarah, I know that you come at this from a different perspective, more of a regulatory, watching, you know, laws, pretty much stuff, maybe more like stuff that's already passed and how it's going to be implemented. I know you're heavily involved with the FTC guide, something that JVC has been a leader on in this industry for as long as I've been in the industry, which is, oh gosh, it's been like 15, 16 years. So if you can speak from that perspective and all the great work that JVC is doing in partnership with JA and others on these issues.
Of course. So hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Yeh, Deputy General Counsel at the Jewelers Vigilance Committee. And I've been with JVC for over a decade now. And what I've seen where we derive value in terms of our work with the Federal Trade Commission is with our members and everyone in the industry. When we get input from you all, that makes our position stronger. If it's just JVC going to the FTC saying, we think this should be this way, they're going to say, great, who else thinks that? Where's your evidence? How can you prove that to us? How can you show us that a consumer is deceived by this terminology? And in order for us to get that, we have to come to the industry and say, okay, do you have evidence? Do you have proof? What's your lived day-to-day experience with this? Now, the Federal Trade Commission, every single time they make a change to a set of guidelines or a rule, they open it up for public comment. JVC, every single time that happens, will organize a response from the jewelry industry. And we work with all of the trade associations and all of our members to make sure that we get input from everybody and feedback from everyone as we're responding. But there's also a mechanism for public comment. And that means anybody can comment on anything that the Federal Trade Commission is doing. You just go to the little Federal Register website and you submit a comment. You can submit one anonymously if you want to. And every time we have more folks saying the same things that we are, it makes that response stronger. And I just want to note also, more in line with what everybody else was saying beforehand, if you are a business owner on this call and you don't have a relationship with your local legislator, your member of Congress or a state senator, start now. Email their office, set up a meeting. There's going to be some staffer at some level who will take a meeting with you, even if you don't know anyone. And you start to build that relationship by setting up a meeting. I'm lucky in that I live across the street from my congressman, and I run into him at CVS, and I can tell him all of my opinions on things when I run into him at CVS. You may not be so lucky as to live so close to your member of Congress, but you can start a relationship with your legislator now, and you should do that absolutely.
I think that's a fantastic point. And actually, the truth is they want to hear from constituents. They want to connect with you because they want your votes. They want to know what you care about. So it's really important to do that. And I'm sure your congressman is not hiding in the aisles when he sees you come into CVS.
Jerry Nadler doesn't hide.
Oh, no. It's Nadler. So there you go. So yes, he's my congressman now too, actually, because now he's on the east side. Yep. In any case, Lenore, I'm going to go ahead and have you take over and go through some of these topics on a one-on-one basis with our panelists at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for joining us. So I'm going to chime in with some questions here for our panelists. I'm going to go through a couple of different topics. All of them Susan's already touched on a little bit. I want to start by talking about retail crime, which is a hot topic. It's one that I cover often for National Jeweler. We recently covered the Jeweler Security Alliance comes out with their annual crime report for 2022, and it showed that crime had reached a record level last year in the industry, including almost double the number of smash and grab robberies when you compare it to 2021. I would like to talk specifically about organized retail crime. An NRF survey found that shrink or loss of inventory was costing retailers almost $100 billion a year in 2021. So I'd like to ask each of you, how concerned are you about organized retail crime? And whoever wants to jump in first is welcome to.
I think it's an area of heightened, not just interest, but just taking notice of it, as it were. There's more coverage of it. You see more retail crime in other retail settings than ours, but it makes you step back and go, what if that happened here? Which makes you change maybe the type of cameras you have, or what capabilities they have, or maybe you come back and you've added laminated glass, or you've added film to your windows, or certain things that maybe you've done along the way for other reasons that benefit at this time. I think it's also good and pointed out just to always be aware of your surroundings and what's going on. And many of us in our retail capacities know our neighborhood, know the folks that are regular to us, and when something's out of the ordinary, you just feel it. I can't tell you why. I don't know what that means, but sometimes, kind of like when you're going to talk about cybercrime stuff, something's just a little bit off makes a big difference. And sometimes that can be the way a person comes in, or what they say, what they want, what they need, or it could be a whole group of people, because sometimes groups they've had lunch next door and they come in. Well, that always used to be something you were greeting, and now you have a question mark because you see video that makes you think, oh no, what can happen quickly here? Because those weren't anything we quantified before kind of the last few years, let's say. So I think it's part of being more assertive, more vigilant, and more understanding of what's going on, not just in your store, but in front of your store, or in front of your place of business, or places of business.
One of the things that is concerning to us has always been this smash and grab, and some of the we were talking about some Latin American gangs that would be coming through the country and organized hitting jewelry stores. We aren't in any worse shape, I think, today than we were 10 years ago in this particular vein. Other retailers have become much more attuned to shoplifting and to minor crimes, especially during the pandemic. situation and a number of our homeless situations and drug issues. That has become an issue. Jewelers have followed to a great extent what our Jewelers Security Alliance has provided us, and our insurance companies, Jewelers Mutual Insurance in particular, where I was on the board, of knowing how to protect our businesses through locked cases, through, as Bill was just saying, special glass, and the costs that we have right now for security, actual bodies who are there in our stores watching out for us. That's an added cost, obviously, and so are all of these things. But we've been much better protected, I think, than a lot of retailers. That doesn't mean that we should let our guide on and understanding of what's going on down in any way. We have to keep vigilant at all times. But we've taken those steps that have been necessary, I think, in our society right now. But we have to be vigilant.
Yeah, I think an awareness of what is happening, the increase in crime has led to more training through all our businesses. We see the groups of people that come in and they have taken things from videos that you see that they've taken from the store, whether it's that or the smash and grabs or all kinds of other things, awareness of what can happen, and then training on what you need to do to be aware, keywords in the store that you can use to make everybody on the sales floor aware of what is happening. So I think that has led to better training, awareness of the staff of what can happen. And it is very concerning. I think for people that are looking to get into the business, they see the crime and, if I work somewhere, what if it happens to me? So it is important that this legislation that is being presented, combating the Organized Retail Crime Act, has some impact on these organized crime organizations.
I did just drop a link to JA's alert on the issue on the Organized Retail Crime Act into the chat. I believe you may have to be a member to access it, but I'm not sure. So if JA members should be able to access that link. And if not, feel free to email me at sposnock@jewelers.org, and I'm happy to share that information with folks as well.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with the Combating Organized Retail Crime Act, long story short, what it would do is it would set up this national coordination center that would gather and share information on organized retail crime, and then it would also provide training and assistance. So leads into my next question. Do you all think that this act would help to combat this issue?
I'll start. I think that it will help with this issue. There are large organizations that have their own warehouses that are moving millions of dollars worth of jewelry and other things that they're stealing and going through legitimate channels. So I think that it will help take a certain segment of this, in large groups. It'll help connect the dots from across the country. And, that's important to get a certain amount of this crime to stop.
I think that it clearly is important. Just realize, though, that we in the jewelry industry, particularly under JSA, have been doing this for years. We've worked with the FBI a number of times. Every luncheon that we have in July usually features what we have done that essentially is being done on a national basis. It points out that what we have taken as important is now important for a number of industries in this country. And it cannot hurt to have this additional impetus and direction. I don't think it's going to affect us as much as it will other retail situations, but it does focus the need for us to take take action against crime that is rampant throughout the country right now in an organized fashion.
Any conversation in this area helps because it normalizes the conversation about protocols or guidance or commentary on these issues. And that's something that helps an individual who's maybe they're part of their, maybe it's just them at their store, maybe them and one other person, and have this kind of commentary go on, or this kind of background, or the fact that there's been this much brought to bear helps them understand what are the good questions asked. There's no wrong questions, but there's just a whole lot going on they can become a part of just by, if nothing else, just being part of this webinar. And I think that the point of the legislation is to bring to the fore the fact that there are ways to kind of track around on this, and there's nothing unusual about it. And everybody deserves the opportunity to shop safely and enjoy doing so. So it's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's certainly an issue that you want to bring awareness to. On a related note, I don't know how useful this is to jewelry sellers, but the Inform Act actually took effect today, and that requires online marketplaces to disclose and verify the identity of the sellers. And that's in hopes of deterring people from selling stolen products and also counterfeit products. So there is some progress being made there. It's not falling on deaf ears. So we're speaking a lot about legislation, but there are a lot of factors that go into rising crime, including social issues like poverty. This is more of an opinion question, I suppose, but do you think passing legislation is necessarily the best way to tackle this issue? Whoever wants to chime in there.
Well, it's one way. I mean,
It's
no,
one
it's,
way.
I mean, is it the, it might be the best in a certain feeling about having more people know about it, especially within our industry. But no, there are other avenues for all of these things. I think that's probably what the last 3 years have been about, is looking at situations radically and totally differently than before, and seeing different kind of answers, different kinds of paths. And I think that's kind of what you would, how I would enter into this is, yes, this potential legislation and its success is one thing, but there are other types of outreach and other types of progress that can be made that you can decide to be a part of in your community or on a different scale or stage. But all of those things add up to something better for someone along the way. I think that's kind of the subtlety of what you're asking there, is how do we all get better in all this? And I think there's a way to do that.
I think, Lenore, what you're really bringing up is that there are other, as Bill says, there are a lot of other ways that we in our communities, besides just legislation, can be involved with. A number of us are involved in nonprofit organizations that do a lot of help for homelessness, for food banks, for childcare issues. These don't necessarily involve legislation. They may involve legislation as far as certain taxing authority, and frankly, we should realize that if we want to cut taxes in one way, we may need to increase them in other ways in order to better serve our community and solve some of the problems that we have. So there are a lot of different ways that we can be involved. We're talking here with JPAC being involved in the legislation for the most part, but in your communities, there is so much more that you can be involved with, whether it's in a Rotary group, whether it's in being on a board of a nonprofit, whether it is just helping your neighbor. All of those things are important, and it also builds our businesses because we are known as parts of our community and in working in our communities to make life better for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we also have an opportunity. I think that, you know, the pandemic presented a lot of challenges, but it also has given us opportunities to sort of radically rethink policies that really weren't working and became so bare, you know, during the pandemic. You know, John mentioned childcare as one. I think that's a huge issue. And you know, on on a personal level, one of the crimes you see happening most often in New York City is someone jumping the turnstile into the subway, right? Like not paying on their way into the subway. And, New York spends a lot of money on enforcement of that. And we could probably take the money for that and just make the subway free. And then it's a different it solves the problem in a different way. I think that, there are lots of ways to sort of like reframe some of these things that we've been looking at for a long time in one way, and take the opportunity to say, oh, we could actually radically change what we do and maybe make life better for everybody.
I think that's one you should definitely suggest to Congressman Nadler next time you see him at the CVS.
I don't think he has a lot of control over the MTA, but I'll let him know.
Yeah. And just to get back to the over point, that one of the reasons why Jewelers of America, first of all, I want to say that we're focusing a little bit more on legislation today, but I consider advocacy going well beyond legislation. It's why we're involved in the Russian diamond issue and making sure that jewelers understand issues like that. It's why, again, jewelers need to connect to their communities, as has been said already. But in terms of the actual bigger picture, as a national organization, our focus really has to be on the national solutions to different issues that can affect our members. Obviously, there's a lot of state-by-state issues when it comes to crime and legislation and things that are happening on the state and local level. And that's where I do think it's really important for folks to be involved there as well. It's just not something as a national organization that we've dipped into, because we want to be able to focus on a solution that can maybe not solve the problem, but help on a national level. Thank you.
There's one thing that I would like to just sort of add when we're talking about community and everything, is being involved in some of the retail associations in your state and your local area, in your chambers of commerce, because we need allies in all of the things that we're really doing. And the more allies we have within the retail industry and within industry in general, the better we are all going to be. We're a small group as jewelers in comparison to a number of other organizations in industry. And we need to have those allies, and we need to work with them on issues if at all possible.
Yeah, absolutely. If no one else would like to chime in, I'm going to move on to our next topic, and that is the exciting world of taxes. John touched on this a little bit earlier. It tends to be the most boring things that are the most important. So I know that some retailers have been calling for an extension or to be made permanent these 2017 tax cuts. Now, a criticism from some of these tax cuts has been that they would disproportionately benefit wealthier Americans, and not like a successful jeweler, like the top 5% of earners in the country. So my question would be, how would your average jeweler benefit from these tax cuts becoming permanent? Whoever wants to dive into that.
So I guess I'll start there. The tax brackets were all lowered. The top level fell from 39.6 to 37, and the other 7 brackets changed, all except for the $11,000 or less bracket. A lot of jewelers are S corporations, and that business profit flows through to their personal income statements, their personal taxes. And so that is a big difference depending on which bracket they're falling into. I think that most jewelers are benefiting from this. And, I see that there's corporations that tax went down 2 to 21%. So I think that most jewelers are affected by this, and the tax cuts help them. More profit to build their businesses, more money to give to the employees, and to advertise with. So I think it was an important thing.
Okay, fair enough. Anyone else want to chime in on
Well,
that?
I'll chime in with a different view, and that's probably why we really aren't all going to be uniform in this. The tax cuts in general benefited large corporations and the very wealthy. I would not in any way personally want to see them made permanent. I would like to see us modifying those and providing for those people on the lower end of the scale, our customers and our people that work in our organizations, in our jewelry stores. They need one of the things that really is irking me, and Sarah brought that up, and that's childcare. And the childcare credits would go out the window in order to make sure that our deficit is lower, in order to provide these taxes. So I think we just need to look at a broader view of the whole idea of the taxation and realize who we are benefiting the most and what the bottom line is going to be, and not be necessarily looking just at a corporate increase in profit, because out the other end of that, if our people are suffering one way or another and have a lower tax bracket, have a higher tax bracket, or proportionately, we're going to be losing our customers. So let's look at the broad picture in all of this and realize that it's not one way or the other that we have. We may end up disagreeing on a couple of things on this. So I'm on one side. I know that Joseph has perhaps a different viewpoint, but we have to look at this as individuals oftentimes.
So I'll just chime in there that the child tax credit went to $2,000, and all the tax brackets were lowered. So there's definitely some benefits that happen for our employees as well. The standard deduction changed for married couples. It changed for singles. Married couples went to $24,000 from $12,700. So there are some differences, that benefited a lot of people. There were some other things that it also took away. The SALT deduction, and I'm in a state that is a significant, I pay a significant amount of money in taxes on my house, and that deduction went away. So there's definitely some changes that happened there that adversely affected me too.
And I think that really makes good sense, Joseph. What you really want to look at is how you might modify that and help the people at the bottom lower end of things, and leave that in line, and maybe change it on the top end. That's my feeling anyway.
I just want to point out that, sorry, Joseph.
As I said, the 7 brackets, all of them were lowered except for the $11,000 and under.
I just want to add to this back and forth in the fact that you're seeing in action the fact that as jewelers, we don't necessarily agree on every single issue, but we know that we need to come together and work through these things. It's just like, I'm sure, Sarah, you'll see different opinions that come in about the FTC guides. I remember being on calls when the discussions over precious metals and diamonds changes, like, the people on Jewelry TV wanted to have, one thing, and other retailers wanted another thing. So it's just having these conversations are so important, even if we don't agree all the time. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to talk to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, because you never know it's always going to flip back and forth who's in charge. And generally speaking, they're good and bad on both sides in terms of being able to support our issues.
Susan, you segued me perfectly into the next topic here. And go ahead, Sarah, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say it's also interesting at the FTC too, they're affected by administration changes as well, because the commission will change as the president changes. And so they may have different priorities shifting with administration changes as well.
So speaking about jewelers getting involved in advocacy, JVC recently asked for jewelers' input on the FTC revisions. So Sarah, what was the response from the industry like? Did you get the sense that people were like excited to be involved in this process?
Yeah, so we're talking about the Federal Trade Commission Green Guides revision, and the Green Guides are their set of guidelines that help everybody across industries with environmental marketing claims. So one of the points that we've been making really, really early on is that as jewelry, we are a very, very small voice in this large cacophony of industries that will really care a lot about a lot of environmental marketing claims. So it's really important to us to speak loudly, to, have a submission that was really well thought out and, and that was comprehensive. So we opened up a sort of like a website comment form so that people could give us direct feedback, and it was open to everyone in the industry, not just JVC members. And we got back a good amount of responses through that. Between Tiffany Stevens and I, we think we had about 100 individual phone calls or meetings with folks to solicit feedback. For a lot of people, it's hard to sit down with a web form and type out your response, but when you can talk through it, we could get a lot more information out. We had multiple webinars where we asked people for input. I think there was a smaller group of people in the jewelry industry who was very excited to give their feedback on this issue. A lot of people had sort of pent up feelings about words like sustainability that does not currently have a definition under the Federal Trade Commission, but they see lots of people in the industry using that word without backing it up and saying, well, how can I use that word? I don't actually believe that I can. Our products come from a hole in the ground, that how do we justify using that terminology? So there was a lot of engagement on terms like that, on terms like recycled, where, again, it's a term that folks in the industry are using that to imply some kind of benefit that may not actually be there. And so how do we look at that terminology? So I think we had a good response from the industry. Tiffany and I also worked really hard to align outside of the jewelry industry. So like we were talking about before, it's really important to have allies. So we were talking to lots of folks in the fashion space in particular, who we thought might have similar viewpoints or issues to those that we do. And then we've since gone to the Federal Trade Commission for a hearing just on the term recycled. It turned out that hearing was mostly about plastics, which isn't necessarily relevant to what we're doing, except that in the hearing, there was a really interesting tidbit about the terminology about reusing something as opposed to remaking it. And we thought, okay, well, there's a hint. So we're very curious to see as well, just sort of, we're paying attention to other industries like milk and meat and leather, which you wouldn't necessarily think would have a lot to do with us, except that all three of those industries also have the issue of synthetic products. So like lab-grown meat and milk and vegan leather and things like that, are all things that are impacting those industries as well. So we're looking to see what those industries are doing, and that will help us moving forward.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's not something I would think of, but I can definitely see the similarities there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, speaking on jewelers having their voices heard, a topic that I hear a lot about are credit card fees. The NRF had said that for most retailers, after their labor cost, their highest operating cost is swipe fees. So my question for whoever would like to chime in first is, how do these swipe fees affect your business?
Well, I think it depends on how hard you work on it and what your relationship is with your banker or your provider. I mean, it's just, yeah. In talking about that being the second most costly, I mean, think of the time you spend with those labor dollars and the folks that you're paying. think about where those dollars are going every time you swipe something. And, you know, as fast as it happens now, I mean, one of the things about retail now is you want to be able to do it quickly. And we use a system where you can either tap and go or whatever, and it can happen very, very, very quickly now. And you have to follow each and every transaction. I mean, you really have to. And it's like anything of this, what gets measured gets done or undone. And you want to make sure that you're within relative situation to other groups, industries, or peers. But you know, what Farmer's Jewelry pays every day is nothing in comparison to what John will do today. You know, there's just a quantum more that goes on, and your ability to change that is about who you align yourself with. Like if you're inside Jewelers of America and we're advocating for something like this helps everyone from top to bottom when you have a uniform answer that's identifiable and followable. And that's kind of where we're going. It was interesting, your earlier question about would legislation help? This is where we're talking about really only legislation could help, or only legislation could potentially level a field or remake it in some capacity. And this would be a classic. This would be a big boxing match between people who make a lot of money off these fees and people who pay a lot of these fees. And a lot of those people could be as large as John's entity or entities, or as small as each one of us. But as a group, it makes a complete difference when you raise your voice, or when you clear your throat to raise your voice. And I think that's the opportunity here, is how more people can come to the conversation to help with these fees or their sometimes egregious nature or application.
Yeah. If you just look at the percentages and what you look at your bottom line, as far as your you make a $10,000 sale, let's say, which is a huge sale, and what's the difference all of a sudden? What do you actually make out of that $10,000 sale? And realize that the swipe fee that you have could be anywhere from 2 to 5%, and if it, depending on how you've been able to negotiate with your bank one way or another. And if it's 5% out of that, that's $500. And that is a really big chunk of what your profit is. So it's something that we all need to look at. We could just say, oh, that's just a small amount, but it sure does add up. And if you think of, that's where the banks make their money, for goodness sake. You know, it's and they make tons of dollars, and it's making it off of our backs that way. And so this type of legislation will be extremely helpful to all of us, particularly to those that are unable to negotiate with their banks appropriately because of their size.
I agree with Bill and John, about how quick it is. You get your payment and you're going through it, and you give them their credit card back in a minute, and that's part of the sales process that's really important. You don't want to be tripping up over taking their money, and make it this process. So on one hand, the credit cards are definitely an important part of our business that eases that payment process and makes it very easy for everybody. They don't even know the money's paid, right? They give you the plastic and it's done. On the other hand, the fees that are involved right now, like John said, they can range, and if it's a points card and this and that, so it is a big chunk out of everybody's pocket. And if this legislation can help lower that while keeping that speed, then it's a win for us.
Well, thank you all. We're at my very last question for the day. I recently wrote a piece about cybersecurity and protecting customer data, which has become a huge issue. What steps have you all taken to safeguard your customers' data?
Well, I will tell you that we follow California's rules and regulations, and they are very, very detailed and are very protective of our customers all the way along. But we have to be very careful about that. And those of us that may not be in California have to be careful about it too, because if you have a customer that happens to live in California and does business with you, you are also going to be under those types of rules and regulations. So it's something you need to be very careful about. And then on another score, make sure you've got insurance on all of these things, because lawsuits come up. Sarah, you're chuckling in the background, but you know, you need to protect yourself. And this is sort of a plug for the insurance industry, but you have to be very careful. The lawsuits are many, and they sort of come from all different directions if you don't follow the rules and regulations appropriately. So you need to protect yourself that way, and you need to be very cognizant of all of the various rules and regulations. And I know Susan can provide some of that information through JA, and I know, Sarah, you probably can also to our listeners, and it's important for everyone to keep an eye out on that.
Yeah, just a note to echo John's point, there are law firms out there whose entire business is based on filing these sort of nuisance lawsuits on the, you know, to like finding businesses who haven't implemented these kinds of regulations or who haven't made their websites accessible for the Americans with Disabilities Act or things like that. And that's literally their entire business model. So these are things that you need to proactively think about to protect yourself. And it's also the case I've had insurance companies contact me to ask questions about, okay, is this something that we should cover? We're trying to do some research to figure out, like, is this something that people know about or not? Things like that. So it's certainly something to make an active part of your business, making sure you are compliant with all of the laws and regulations out there so that you can avoid lawsuits in the future.
Yes, that is definitely solid advice. That is it for my questions. I'm going to turn it over to Susan to see if we have any audience questions for our last 10 minutes or so here.
Okay, great. And thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lenore, for such great questions. I do have some questions that came in ahead of time, but there are, there's an opportunity for anyone on the webinar who is interested to and has a question, go ahead and add it to the chat or the Q&A, and I will relay it to our panel. But just in terms of some questions that came in earlier, just look through these. Interesting. What are the chances of collaborating with others to create a criminal enhancement for daytime smash and grab robberies? And I think that's, getting organized and speaking to each other about these issues is essentially what we're trying to do in the first place. And as John already pointed out, is something that JSA has been a leader in for a long time for our industry. But does anyone else want to comment specifically on that particular question? Let's see. If not, then I think we've pretty much covered that. Let's just see. Now this must be a plant question, because somebody asks, who are the biggest advocates for the industry right now on Capitol Hill? So I'm going to toot my own horn and say that I think in terms of the jewelry industry, it's Jewelers of America. But again, like we work with industry organizations like JVC, and there's areas that we can't be experts in every single area. So I'm not going to be able to tell you about sort of the legal side of things as much as somebody like Sarah can. And I think it's just really important as an industry, through groups like the Jewelers Leadership Forum and the USJC, that jewelers are just constantly, communicating and supporting these groups, and that we're speaking with one voice on issues like Russia, for example. But I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that, but I've seen, especially really since COVID in particular, really connecting with other organizations in the industry. And I know that there was kind of like a hotline of email exchanges and regular meetings, especially at the beginning of the crisis, with different jewelry organizations, and saying, hey, we're all in this together, and what can we do as an industry with our different expertise to support the industry as a whole? So I think, again, I'm kind of answering the question in
Yeah.
a self-serving way, but I think it's true. And I think that if you're not aware and haven't gotten involved, there are definitely opportunities to do so. John, did you want to add something?
Well, just to, yeah, that's what we were really talking about. It's finding allies. There's also allies within our industry. Sarah at JVC. We have John Kennedy at JSA. We have Jewelers Mutual from an insurance standpoint. We have also our training organizations. We have the American Gem Society. All of these organizations can work together and provide some of that information, and also do the lobbying that's necessary oftentimes for us. It's not just us in JA and JPAC doing the lobbying and talking to our legislators, but all of the other organizations that we depend upon, in dealing with that.
Yeah, and just to add, the USJC, the United States Jewelry Council, one of the reasons why Jewelers of America and other organizations decided to form it was because the US government and other governments were saying to us as an industry,
Yes.
we can't have all these different groups coming and speaking separately on the same thing. Get yourselves organized. And that's going to be really critical as we face the upcoming changes to the importation rules around diamonds related to Russia. Again, not something that I'm going to go into right now. And Sarah's obviously well-versed on that as well, probably more than I am in terms of importation rules. But it's just so important. Again, I'm beating a dead horse here, but speaking with one voice within the industry and working together.
Yeah, and I'll take an opportunity to just say that I think for JVC, we see our role as interpreting legislation and regulation for the industry, right? And making sure that every business in the industry understands how to comply with all of the rules that apply to doing business here in the US. But that a lot of that means that we have direct, important relationships with regulators in the federal agencies that touch the jewelry industry. And that's not just the ones that you think of. So it's, not just the Federal Trade Commission or the Treasury Department or the State Department, but it's also the Nuclear Regulatory Commission because of irradiated gemstones. And it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because of any animal or plant products used in jewelry. And that really is our role, making sure we have a handle on everything that's going on in all the various federal agencies. And, one of the ones during COVID that, we really sort of went back to was, OSHA is putting out all of these guidelines for how to operate a business during COVID. We got to figure out how we can get jewelry businesses to understand what their different regulations are, and 6 feet apart and plexiglass and all kinds of things like that. So that's really how we see our role as different than lobbying. Ours is about legislation and regulation and federal agency work.
And extremely helpful. So we appreciate everything that you do, and just complimentary to what Jewelers of America is doing. Bill, did you have something to add? Because I don't want to cut you off, but we are just about out of time.
No, I mean, John is the ultimate policy wonk on all of this. He has more people on speed dial than all of us combined, and he does a great job with that. But what it points out is, or what the question really asked was, when we go to Washington as a JPAC group, we're a group of retailers from our size to John's size and all in between. But occasionally you run into somebody who's maybe there from Walmart or from Tiffany or somewhere else. There are other pockets of interest and opportunity out there that we are still trying to link up with. That's what we're still being challenged about in a State Department kind of way, to kind of clear your throat, have something to say, and be ready to say it. And certainly at this day and time, given the tectonics of the world and things that are happening so broadly, and sources of supply and where things come from and how they got there and what they really cost, we need more friends. And this webinar is about helping people come a little bit closer through this webinar, and then maybe spending more time with us personally or in another call or another setting. But the more we can kind of get our act together, the better off we will all be, and the better protection we'll give to the consumer. And that's the ultimate idea here, is making sure that we've protected them in what we do.
And a great shout out really to end our webinar is to support JA and to support JPAC, and to realize that we are going to go back and introduce a bunch of people to Congress and the situation that is out there right now. And we can use additional people coming back and expressing their needs and your needs to our legislators, and we'll help in any way possible to set up meetings, et cetera, and to get you involved.
Yeah, that's a great point. And definitely feel free to reach out to me anytime, sposnock@jewelers.org. I should probably type that into the chat, but it's sposnock@jewelers.org. Like I said, we're going to be sending out information about our fly-in very soon. It's an amazing event. If you've never been to a fly-in in DC, it's a really fascinating, interesting experience, and I highly recommend it, whether or not you consider yourself political or not. I assume most folks on the call are at least interested in these topics. But also, if you're in the DC area, we're going to be having that member meetup. We'll probably have some kind of speaker that's going to be focused on these issues as well. It should be a really interesting event as well on the 12th of September. So definitely stay tuned. We are out of time. I really appreciate, thank you so much, Lenore, for helping to coordinate and all your great questions and co-moderation. Much appreciated. And thank you to our panelists today for their insightful comments and, just being able to share different perspectives for our one industry. Just want to note that the webinar, we did receive one question, is whether or not this is going to be available as a recording. As I said at the beginning, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on Jewelers of America's website, as well as on National Jewelers website in the coming days. So stay tuned for that. And my next question, which was our collaborative webinar that we've been doing this year, is kind of taking off the next couple of months for the summer, but we'll be back in September with new webinars. Always keep an eye out on your email, though, because you never know when something might come up that is important enough that we want to put something on the schedule even over the summer. But with that said, thanks everyone for joining us today. Hope you all have a great summer. Have a great 4th of July. And thanks again. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.